Thank you very much. It's wonderful to be here on this tremendous occasion of the announcement of the Institute, and to the Dean family, I think it's a wonderful gift and a wonderful subject. We meet as capitalism is under some duress. Indeed, I would call it a crisis of capitalism. And what I'd like to talk about briefly for maybe 25 or 30 minutes is a fundamental thesis that I believe to be central to business as we practice it in the United States and around the world. And that is that fusing high performance with high integrity are the twin goals, not only of contemporary capitalism, but of contemporary companies. What do I mean by high performance? Strong, sustained economic growth based on superior, high-quality goods and services that provide durable benefits to shareholders, but also to all the other critical stakeholders that are important for a company's existence, and that balances risk-taking with risk management. And I'm going to come back at the end because I do want to talk about the financial crisis at the very end of my remarks. What is high integrity? It is, first of all, the robust adherence to the formal rules that exist, legal and financial. It is, secondly, the voluntary adoption of global ethical standards that bind the company and its employees. And it is, thirdly, employee commitment to the core values of honesty, candor, fairness, reliability, and trustworthiness. Let me stop for a minute. All of us in this room have been in organizations. We know that when those organizations are characterized by turf fighting, backbiting, and selfishness, they can't work. That you do need these core values among the employees of candor, fairness, honesty, trustworthiness, and reliability to have a can-do, mission-oriented, get-it-done kind of company or university or nonprofit or whatever the case may be. But I submit, and the reason I talk about these three elements is that you cannot have those values in your employees unless you have the other two elements as well, unless you have that robust adherence to the rules, the third-grade rules, and unless you also have a stand taken by the company on the critical ethical issues that it faces, whether it's working here or across the globe. The basic argument of the book is that this fundamental thesis of high performance with high integrity can really only be implemented by the CEO and the top business leaders. In the last 10 years or 8 years since Enron, WorldCom, we've had an enormous amount of time spent on directors. Directors are very important. In the Q&A, I'd like to talk about the right-sized role of the board if that comes up. But the reality is we spent too much time on directors. That the third dimension of governance, the governing of the company from the CEO down, is where performance with integrity is really going to happen. The first dimension is shareholders in the company. The second dimension is the board and management. The third dimension, CEO down, governance on the front lines. That's where it really has to happen. In the book, I talk about why this thesis is so important and how to do it. Let me talk briefly about the why, talk about a couple of the principles on how to do it, and then end with a few comments on the current financial sector meltdown and why the governance movement failed so badly there and what we need to do. In terms of the benefits, there's first of all the benefit of avoiding risk, as everyone knows. I'm not going to go into great depth on this, but the fact is I started working at GE in late 1987. Between that time and today, the effects of a catastrophic miss have moved from $50 million to billions of dollars. Not only do the senior management get fired, indicted, jailed, but the company suffers terrible harms to its employees, to its market cap, to its suppliers, to its customers, to its communities, and indeed can basically collapse in light of such a miss. So clearly one advantage of all of this effort to fuse performance with integrity is to avoid the catastrophic miss. But there's a second set of affirmative benefits in my judgment, which are more important. There are benefits inside the company, in the marketplace, and in the global society. I will not enumerate them all. They're discussed in the book, but they come down to really one word, and one word that maybe is the most important word we're going to talk about today at all, and that's trust. That you need to have high performance with high integrity to basically have the trust of the community, the employees, the retirees, the media, the regulators, everyone who touches your corporation or your organization for that matter. So that the goal for all of us is to create that kind of trust which allows us to do business or run a university or run an NGO in the best possible way. So I think that we really need to understand why we are so concerned with this set of issues. And it really, as I say, comes down to trust, because it is the trust that allows corporations to have the enormous power that they have to allocate capital, to fire people, to create new products, to innovate, to spend money on technology. We, of course, live in a mixed economy, but at least until today, when I think we are going to have a period of re-regulation, at least until today, even in this mixed economy, corporations have had an enormous amount of freedom, and they've had that freedom, I think, because of the trust. How do we do this? How do we create this fusion of performance with integrity? The most important word, of course, is culture, that we need an affirmative corporate culture. And culture is sort of defined as shared principles, the values, policies, and attitudes, and the shared practices, the norms, the systems, and the processes, which influence how people think and behave, how they think and behave, and that is so critical. Now, you can first have a negative culture, the fear of being caught, and we clearly do need prescriptions and precepts of one's, whether ethical or legal or financial or whatever, that must be followed, and if you violate them, there are consequences. But what you really want is not that negative culture. You want an affirmative culture, where the leaders make clear that they want people to do the right thing, or they want them to ask knowledgeable people if they have questions about whether or not what they're doing is right. In the business literature, there is a distinction between leadership and management. It goes back about 25 years. And leadership is defined as adapting to change, and management is defined as dealing with complexity. And you clearly need both. But you clearly need to deal with that complexity inside the company with robust practices driven deep into the business operations that have real consequences and are staffed with great people. If you don't do this as a leader of the company, if you don't have this kind of effort, visceral, intense effort of embedding performance with integrity disciplines into the business process, then tone at the top, which is the phrase everyone talks about, is really just eyewash. It is so critical for creating the kind of culture that we're talking about, and that is essential, I think, to high performance with high integrity. Let me talk now about a couple of the principles that are so essential to this being done. This is the how part of the discussion. The first one is really, and it's the beginning and in a way the end, is the commitment and consistency of key leaders. There is much discussion in corporations, as many of you who've either worked with them, in them, advised them, there isn't always a tendency to say that the ethical, legal, financial issues are responsibility of the staff and not the leaders. The leaders don't have time. Well, that's wrong. This culture has to flow from top leadership, from the CEO and all the other operational managers. The staff leaders have a tremendous role to play, and I'll come back to that in a moment, but it has to flow from the leaders down. Consistent and committed leadership. You have to put integrity first. Let me read to you a message that was given every year by first Jack Welch, who I worked for, and then Jeff Immelt, both CEOs of GE, when we met with our 200 top officers and then our 600 top managers, which included those 200 officers. Here's what they said in essence. The words may vary every year, but here's what they said in essence. The corporation is built on its reputation, and performance with integrity is the foundation. Each senior leader, and it would be a room like this, and he would look out, whichever one of them it was, would look out at people like you and say, each senior leader will be personally accountable. There will be no cutting of corners for commercial reasons. Integrity must never be compromised to make the numbers. One strike and you're out. You can miss the numbers and survive. You miss on integrity and you're gone. Now, those are great words, but what did they mean? Well, let me give you two examples, because the CEO has to drive this in a way that the organization understands. In one case, we had a leader who'd been with the company for 30 years in an emerging market, doing pretty well, but was losing market share to a European rival. We had gone to market with our own distribution. He changed the distribution to third parties. He did not do the proper diligence. Our audit staff discovered that these third-party distributors were bribing people. He should have known that from the beginning. There wasn't a debate weighing his value to the company versus what he'd done. This was a fundamental rule, no bribery. That rule had been bent, not defended. he was fired, and the organization knew it, and it was communicated to the organization. An even more thunderous message is when there is an act of omission, not commission, when the leader fails to create the kind of culture that I'm talking about. And let me give an example that I gave to some of the students this morning over in the Student Center. We were involved in a huge military procurement scandal involving the Israeli Air Force and GE's military engines business, where the head of procurement for the Israeli Air Force and our foreign sales manager were skimming money fraudulently off of a program where the U.S. gave money to the Israelis to buy fighter planes from U.S. suppliers. We put the engines on those fighter planes. We fired about 25 people after an exhaustive investigation, settled with the government, worked things out. But the final issue that remained was, what should we do with the leader of the military engines business? A 30-year veteran of GE, built the business, great person, lots of technological innovations, but he had presided over a culture where people knew for 5 years that this was going on. 25 or more people knew or ignored red flags, and there was a great debate about what to do. And at the end of the day, the chairman at that time, Welch, said that he had to go. In a way, that was maybe the most important thing that was ever done in this whole area and all the time that I was at GE, because it told the organization that the leaders, the generals, were going to be held to a higher standard than the employees. And a failure to create the culture was a terminating event. Then you have to communicate this, and I was asked by the chairman to speak to a group like this to explain the issue in some detail, which is, sometimes embarrassing, but I think part of this culture is also being very candid about your mistakes. And I have never spoken to so large a group that was so silent, because they realized the consequences of what their obligations were as a result of this termination. The last thing, again, for many people in this room, they will appreciate in terms of this leadership, consistency, and commitment, and I do spend time on it at the beginning because so much flows from it, is that leaders also have to treat all meetings as if they were public meetings. You cannot be a hypocrite. Being a hypocrite goes across the organization as fast as all the fancy words. If I'm the leader and I stand up in front of you and I say performance with integrity, but I go back to a meeting and I make fun of the people who are trying to raise integrity issues or raise ethical issues or make fun of the regulators or don't take it seriously, that message gets out across the organization just as fast, in fact, probably faster than the speech I'd give in front of you and as webcast to the company. So this is really critical. The second principle, and I've indicated what its importance is to manage performance with integrity as a business process. It is very hard to get leaders to do this. You have to make it clear from the top that this is what you want. Remember, I mentioned that management is confronting complexity head-on. Think about it for a second. If we're just thinking about the laws in the United States for a company like GE, which does everything from broadcast television, NBC, to making aircraft engines, to making medical equipment, we have all the U.S. laws and regulations. We've got the federal, state, and local variations. Multiply that 100 times, because we operate in 100 countries. I didn't mention we have 320,000 employees, which is roughly the size of Orlando or Buffalo. Add differing levels of government in each nation. In the EU, we've got Brussels and the member states. In China, we've got the center, we've got the provinces, we've got the local governments. Add employees with different levels of responsibility, and then add erratic enforcement and corruption in probably half the countries in which we do business in the legal system. That is a problem of great complexity. So you have to build what I call the integrity infrastructure. Everywhere, every day, everyone, prevent, detect, and respond. And you've got to do the hard work that the accountants understand, that the lawyers understand, but it's got to be done by the business leader, which is to look at all your processes, whether you're in manufacturing, in engineering, in IT, in sales, whatever it is. Look at those processes, map them, and then look at all the places in which requirements intersect with those processes and have controls to make sure that you're going to do the right thing. That requires a lot of resources and a lot of time, but if you embed them into those business processes, you can do business. These rules do not stop you from doing business. You can do business very well, but it takes work to get to that place. So this second principle is really important, and you have to be willing to devote the resources and hire the A players and make clear that this is a central part, a foundational part of what you do as a corporation. Thirdly, a third principle is to adopt global ethical standards. I speak a lot to law students and business students, and I used to speak at the GE Business School, which basically taught nearly 10,000 members of our community every year. And I always would say, the first question you ask yourself is it legal, other than the business questions? The first question you ask yourself is it legal? And that's often not a hard question because the law is not an easy question because the law is gray and you have choices. That's not easy to answer. But really the last question you should ask yourself is it right? Is it right for your institution in the setting where you exist? We know, for example, and I often use this example, that in Enron, a great law firm, Vincent Elkins, gave advice to Enron. And they gave advice and basically said things were okay legally. That advice may be questionable, but what was, I think, sad was that what Enron was doing was clearly not right, and the law firm didn't give advice to that. So we have to always ask ourselves what is right. And I think that if you look at every company, they do things which are beyond what the law requires. In the case of GE, we did things that committed us as a company, that we basically made requirements of our suppliers, and we even had certain requirements for our customers. For ourselves, just to give examples, we didn't bribe. For our suppliers, we had what we called ethical sourcing: no child labor, no prison labor, good conditions for work, decent wages, environmental compliance programs. And for our customers, and as an example, if in China ultrasound is used for sex selection abortions, and we basically had to educate that this was completely wrong, that they could not, even though the title of the equipment had passed, that it was the wrong thing to do, that we were not going to deal with the family planning agency in China, which basically was in charge of keeping the one-child policy alive and reducing the population. So a very delicate and complicated issue where we had to do all that we could to avoid the use of our equipment for that kind of activity. There are many different reasons why you would adopt these global ethical standards. And that's another thing that I think people don't always understand. Yes, it derives to some extent from common morality, from fundamental beliefs that people have around the globe. But it may also be to avoid a catastrophe. It may simplify things. It may increase your reputation. There are many different and complex reasons. So one of the things that I like to, when I talk to business groups, to say is this is a set of issues that isn't just abstract and it's not just ad hoc. You can reason about it. You need to set up a process by which you identify all your stakeholders, all their ethical concerns, you prioritize them, you analyze them, you decide whether or not you're going to take action. It can be done on a very systematic basis. We tried very hard to do it. It is basically a risk-reward decision. You decide what is the cost, but that cost is really an investment, and what is the reward. But the reward is not discounted rates of return necessarily or metrics. It involves values and judgment that must be imposed or decided at the highest levels by the top business leadership and by the board, because it's what the corporation stands for. Let me very briefly mention just two other principles very briefly, and then try to end in about 5 minutes or so we can get to the panel. Another principle is basically that the top staff, that means the general counsel, the CFO, the HR leader, have to be both partners and guardians in the corporation. Again, I think that there is nothing more important than understanding the tension between these two things. In cases like Enron, the lawyers, for example, weren't even in the room. They were viewed as naysayers. They weren't even present at the table. In cases like the options backdating, they were very involved in doing exactly what the CEO wanted. To be effective as these top staff people, you have to be their partner. You have to help them achieve their performance goals, their business aspirations. You've got to be involved and be at the table. But at the same time, your ultimate responsibility is to the institution and not to the chairman or the other business leaders. That can create a lot of difficulty. If any of you have been in fast-moving, tough institutions where the CEOs always want to move quickly, they don't sometimes want to hear things. These top staff people, to be guardians, have to have the courage, have to have the independence, have to have the guts to stand up and say, time out, This is a tough issue. We need to think about this a little bit. Let's not go there. Let's see if we can come up with different options for dealing with this. This is often arises not in situations where it's black and white. Most of the issues that we face in life are gray. And so the question you have to talk to the CEO or the leader about is how close to the line do you want to be, whether it's an ethical line or a legal line. Do you want to be very close? The law can change, the ethics can change, your reputation can be harmed, the decision maker can change. Or do you want to be more on a safer place along a continuum away from the line of illegality or unethical behavior? And you need the time to kind of examine the facts and give people options. So this partner-guardian tension is critical to be understood, and I say it not because from a staff perspective, but it's something that the CEO, it's one of the principles in this book for CEOs, they have to understand that that's what they want from people. They want people who are going to raise not only how to help you get to the performance goal, but how you're going to deal with guarding the corporation and doing the ethical thing, the lawful thing, the right thing, as the case may be. A last principle is really about pay. And we need to pay for performance, which is a much discussed thing again in the last 5 or 6 years, but we need to pay for performance with integrity. And there are ways of measuring integrity. Let me come back to that when I talk at the very end in a few minutes about the financial meltdown. So this is a very brief synopsis, if you will, of what I try to argue in the book. I then take these principles and apply them to some of the very tough situations that companies face in emerging markets, in acquisitions and dispositions, in public policy, in crisis management, and with respect to their reputation. And I try to deal with sort of some of the basic debates about corporations that have been very alive in our society in the last decade. As I say on corporate governance, we need to focus more on the CEOs and less on the boards. Not that the boards are not very important, but more on the CEOs and how they govern the company. With respect to global ethics, we need to understand how to set up processes and how to reason about them, that they're not something that should be ignored, nor are they something which are just random and ad hoc and just come from the tummy or the heart of one person. They really are susceptible to routines and processes and analysis, just like any other corporate process. People have to understand that, but at the end of the day, it does involve questions of judgment and value, not metrics. So that's another debate that I discuss. Yet another one is corporate social responsibility, where I think that the corporate social responsibility phrase is itself wrong, that we ought to be talking about corporate citizenship, and not surprisingly to me, corporate citizenship has the elements of high performance, compliance with law, and taking ethical actions. And I think if you think about those 3 elements as being the core of corporate citizenship, it helps you understand better what companies should do. And it very much relates to the question of public policy, where sometimes corporations should do things voluntarily, but other times we do need positive law to level the playing field, that ironically positive law can increase competition, not destroy competition. We all believe today, I think, in the antitrust laws, that people should not fix prices or divide markets. That makes for better competition. I think we believe that there should be disclosure of accounts and other things to the public so investors can see as best they can what companies are about. But those are things that are, sure they are regulatory, but they are ironically creating a floor over which competition can take. So I think at times, the corporate social responsibility, people come to corporations asking to do things voluntarily, when really their requests should be addressed to legislatures, and indeed, CEOs should sometimes say, what we need is a sensible solution to level the playing field rather than doing it voluntarily or just saying no. It's sometimes easy to say no to the corporate social responsibility group, but the need may be so great that we have to do it. We could disagree about climate change. I'm not here to argue whether or not there is climate change going on. I would say that if there is going to be an answer, if you thought there was a problem, that is an answer that a corporation cannot deal with voluntarily. It is going to require some kind of coherent approach both in the United States and around the globe. Again, you could disagree and just say it's not an issue, and that's fair enough. But if it is an issue and if you're going to have to solve it, it's not going to be done through voluntarism, at least in my judgment. Okay, let me end there about sort of the book and just make a final comment on the meltdown of the financial sector. I think what saddens me greatly, and I think what makes the announcement of this institute so important, is that we have had a massive failure of business leadership in the last few years. In certain respects, what's happened in the last couple of years is different than Enron and WorldCom. In Enron and WorldCom, we had bad leaders at the top who busted through the systems and perverted the systems and the checks and balances in the company and basically committed fraud, an intentional act. In the situation that we've seen in the financial sector, we have a situation where all the systems failed. It wasn't just the CEOs. In fact, often the CEOs didn't really understand exactly what they were doing. That's what's so remarkable about this. Finance failed, accounting failed, legal failed, risk failed, operational leadership failed, the top leadership failed, the boards failed. They all failed. Because in my judgment, if we look at the financial meltdown, there are many secondary causes. Bad regulation, bad regulators, sort of sleepy business media, maybe the accounting firms, maybe not, the consumers themselves. But who made the fundamental decisions to allocate capital and to leverage the companies up and to put it all into the housing market and to create instruments that no one could understand? That was done at the business level. That was business leadership. So we have had, in my judgment, at both the operational level, the leadership level, and at the board level, a tremendous, tremendous failure of leadership, which has caused this enormous crisis of trust in capitalism. We are at a situation now where we are going to clearly have at least movements for re-regulation and to preserve the safety and soundness of the financial system, which I think we can all say it's affecting all of our lives. The safety and the soundness of the financial system was seriously impaired. And I don't think we want to go through this again. We're not going through the normal business cycle. We're going through something far worse. And sort of the rocket fuel for that came with the financial meltdown. So I think I would leave you with the thought that we do need to, the work of this institute and the work of this school and the work of business schools around the country is critically important, because in my judgment, and the reason I wrote my book, was it's far better if we can have high performance with high integrity inside the company, if we can have institutions and leaders that make it happen inside the company, rather than have regulators who are very imperfect instruments at best take these things over. And one example, and I'll just end on this note, one example would be executive compensation, which has gotten a tremendous amount of attention, I think deservedly so. I'm going to oversimplify a little bit, but not by much, that the leaders in the financial services sector were basically paid annual cash compensation for churning paper, for not creating real economic value or for understanding risk. So that the rocket fuel of the crisis, to some extent, was the way the compensation systems worked. And it was part of a period of avarice and greed in our society that occurs like this, sadly. And so we do have to address the question of compensation. At the core of companies, in my judgment, and this is what I've tried to indicate in my remarks, are really two things that create great companies. The right balance between risk-taking and risk management. We need risk-taking. We, of course, have to innovate and create. It's the genius of our system. But we can't avoid also thinking about risk management, and obviously we need to fuse performance and integrity. So guess what? Boards ought to think about those specs as the core specs when they hire a CEO. We don't do that. They ought to figure out ways to compensate people for having that essential balance at the core of the company. We don't do that. We should have management development systems that train people to have those skills and that balance and reward it, and we don't have that. So we have a long way to go, but I'm an optimist. We can change, and I think it's with mechanisms like the Dean Institute that we can start down that path of restoration, which I think is so necessary. Thank you very much.